Chaos at the airport. This is a story about something that happened to me and my grandma when I was 6 or 7, so 2001 or 2002. For context, I'm a girl, and at the time I was living in a city that was somewhat small but is politically important, so it always had an airport. My aunt was flying in, and as she'd lived in another town for ages, we were very excited to welcome her at the airport. We made our way to the gate people came out of after picking up their luggage. I remember being very chatty while waiting, and at some point my grandma grabbed my hand real hard and gave me a look that just said, "Shut up." I thought I had said something wrong, but after a while I realized she was trying to listen to the people that were standing right next to us. They seemed to be fighting a lot. Also, my grandma has always been very gossipy. I looked over at them, and they were an old man and a very pregnant woman, and were just discussing something which didn't really interest 6 or 7-year-old me, so I ignored it. And now some things get fuzzy in my memory, so I'll tell you what I remember, and then what my grandma told me happened. I remember hearing the old man scream something like, "There he is! I'm gonna get him!" over and over, until this man comes out of the sliding glass doors. Then I just remember that people all around started screaming, and my grandma threw me on the ground and laid on top of me. I heard noises like fireworks and screams, and feeling suffocated both by my grandma and some sort of weird smell, and also by how hot it was under her. So I was feeling really bad and started screaming. I tried to push her off, and for a moment raised my head and saw a lot of red close to my face on the ground, and lots of people laying down with hands on their heads. Everything smelled bad and hot. I don't really know how to describe it. At this point, my grandma pushed my head quite forcefully to the ground and whispered, "Stop and play dead now," in the most serious voice I had ever heard from her. I didn't understand what was happening before that, and was quite angry with my grandma for being forceful, but as she said this, I began to understand that this was serious, and I got quiet really fast while trying not to cry. At some point, she got off of me and all but carried me to stay behind a large pillar. I remember feeling very shaky in the legs, as if I had no strength, but there was a police officer there who told me everything was going to be all right. There were other people there who looked scared too, and we just sat down in silence for some time while we heard police talking and the old man crying and screaming very loudly. Then it got really quiet, and I remember being taken to a room where I had to say what I knew to more officers for a while until we could go. When they took me there, an officer used his hand to cover my eyes in the way, and I remember feeling just angry and tired of being handled around. Tried to take his hands off, and saw just for a moment the pregnant woman lying on her back. This image is forever in my head since that day. Now for the details my grandma told me later on. She told me what happened only a few years back. At the time this took place, she just explained to me that a very bad man did bad stuff, but he was arrested and I shouldn't worry. But, as she explained recently, what happened was that the old man was the woman's father, and apparently she was very young and got pregnant by this guy. I'll call him Dick, who then just ran away and abandoned her. He was coming back because she'd recently been in touch, and he had reconsidered about being a dad. except when her father found out about this. He was very angry and decided to take revenge on Dick for leaving in the first place. My grandma said she learned this on the news later, but in the airport she heard the father talking about how Dick ruined her life and had to pay, and how he wasn't going to let anyone treat her like that. And she kept telling him that she loved the guy, that he had come round, to not do anything. I should add maybe that abortions aren't legal here, and that the only way to get one is either paying a lot of cash to someone to do it illegally, or getting sketchy drugs from sketchy people, which can result in a lot of bad stuff. And as you may have guessed, her father had a gun, and as Dick came out of the glass door with his luggage, he whipped it out. And that's when people start screaming, and my grandma throws me on the ground, and also when everyone gets on the ground too. Except he didn't just kill that guy. Apparently, he was either too emotional, or had never done it before, or both, and couldn't aim right, and hurt some other people too, who took grazing bullets, or got shot in non-fatal places. While this is happening, the woman keeps screaming that she loves her baby daddy, and when her dad managed to aim right, she threw herself in the way. Both her, Dick, and the baby got killed instantly. My grandma said that this happened really fast, and the police showed up right when he shot them. This is when the old guy calms down a bit, or at least isn't trying to shoot anyone anymore. So there's a lot of police trying to get the gun from him, and people start to get up and hide. This is when we go behind the pillar. It takes a few minutes, but he just lets go of the gun, probably sad at his daughter and grandchild's death. And the police take him finally. I think it took the police some time to show up, because at the time it was a very small airport, low in crimes and such. My grandma said the whole thing happened in about 20 minutes, but to me it felt like ages. As I only talked to my grandma recently, I hadn't realized how close we'd been to the old man and his daughter, and that when I saw red just a few inches from my nose, I probably saw someone who had been hurt so close to me, and was putting myself in danger trying to push her off. I'm forever grateful that she protected me so well that I hadn't even realized the situation we were in until recently. Oh, and about my aunt? As soon as the shooting started, people inside the sliding glass door were told to go back the corridor, according to her, so my aunt was completely safe when we managed to reach her. Dangerous adventure. This happened a few years ago, when I was 13. I was somewhat popular in school at the time, and I had around 4 very close friends. Rose, Lynn, Noah, and Zach were the main ones. We went on many adventures around that time. Camping, road trips, the beach. Noah's family was pretty wealthy, and all of our families were pretty lenient with rules. One day, the summer before 8th grade, we went on a camping trip with Lynn's older sister Margot and Zach's older brother Todd. So there were 7 of us. Lynn, Zach, and I were 13. Noah and Rose were 14, and Margot and Todd were both 17. We decided to go camping in a nearby forest, around 20 miles from Noah's house. It was pretty much in the middle of nowhere. Noah's house and his neighborhood were the closest homes, and there were no signals for phones or any electronics. We get to the spot easily and without problems, and we make camp. The girls in one tent, the boys in another. Maybe it was a bad idea to have 7 teens, ages 13 to 17, with no phone in the woods. But our parents were lenient, like I said, and confident we would be fine, since the woods were not known for anything bad or dangerous. So we set up the tents, go swimming in a nearby lake, and come back and make dinner over a fire, which was about 20 feet away from the tents, which were 4 feet away from each other, by the way. We have s'mores and do all those stupid camping things before Lynn and Margot announce they're going to sleep. That left Todd, Rose, Zach, Noah, and I, as we joked around, told scary stories, and just overall had a good time. Then Margot walks up, annoyed, and tells us that whoever it is messing with the side of the tent to stop it. Keep in mind, no one left the group, and the tents were far enough away to not bother anyone in the tents. She explains that someone keeps on touching the side of the tent, running something on it, and we dismiss her. Todd states that it's probably a tree branch, and Rose and I decide to go to sleep as well. So we head back to the tent. Lynn is asleep, and we settle in, me closest to the opening, Margot next to Lynn, who's at the opposite side of the tent, and Rose in between Margot and I. I managed to fall asleep easily within 5 minutes, until I woke up suddenly for what seemed like no reason. I checked my phone. I still brought it and a portable charger just to take pictures. And it was literally the middle of the night at 2:15. I looked around, my eyes getting used to the darkness, trying to figure out why I woke up. A tapping sound on the tent was what I first noticed, and a soft giggling. It sounded somewhat deep, like a male voice, but I couldn't be sure. After what felt like an hour but was probably a minute or two, the tapping and giggling stopped. I was convinced it was my imagination, or maybe one of the boys trying to prank us, or even a tree branch, like Todd suggested earlier. Telling myself it was a tree branch and lack of sleep, I fell back asleep until Rose woke me up around dawn. Everyone was awake, and we decided to hike a little. We decided to go in 2 groups, because we planned on spending the night again, and we didn't want anyone messing with our stuff. Even though these woods weren't popular with camping, we didn't want to risk it. Margot, Lynn, Rose, and I left to go hiking for a couple hours, while the boys opted to stay behind and fish, swim, and cook food. We hiked for about 2 hours, and we came back to the boys not at the campsite. Annoyed, Margot went down to the lake with Lynn to find them. Rose and I made our way back to the tents, and I'll be honest and say I screamed and almost wet my pants. The tents were slashed. I inspected it closer after regaining composure, because I was usually the more collected one of the 2 of us. It seemed made with a small knife, as the cuts were small. Our tents were made of material that was pretty hard to cut into, and it seemed like the person had a pocket knife, I guessed. The boys, Margot and Lynn, came running to our screams, and were obviously startled. We decided to pack up and head home early, because for one, the tents were ripped too much to use again comfortably, and 2, Rose, Lynn, and I were very creeped out. Even more so when Todd announced that his tires were slashed. We were all freaking out, obviously. There was no cell service, Todd's tires were slashed, and there was no way any of us wanted to stay any longer. Luckily, Todd reported that Margot's tires looked fine, and Margot stated that she would take Noah and Lynn, drop them off to call 911 and their parents, and come back for us. She drove a car, and there wasn't enough room for more than 3 people, as the back was filled up with the camping stuff. Zach, Todd, Rose, and I were left at the campgrounds, and we decided to begin a hike back towards the main road, so Margot wouldn't have to drive so far. Also, Rose and I refused to stay anywhere near the camp area. We began hiking. My phone died. The last time I looked at it, it was 1 in the afternoon. Zach and Rose both had working phones and constantly updated us on how far we had been walking. I began to hear branches snapping from behind us, closer to the trees than we walked, and I got more and more paranoid as time went on. I told Todd, and he seemed to get more wary of our surroundings, constantly looking over his shoulder. We had been walking for about 30 minutes. Margot was probably at Noah's house, or almost there, when Todd screamed, "Run!" Naturally, I looked behind my shoulder before I began running. 3 hooded figures were running towards us. 2 had knives, and they all looked around 6'3" or taller. Todd was 6'1", but I doubted he could defend all of us against them. Even though it was broad daylight, I couldn't make out any facial features. They all appeared over or around 200 pounds. The shortest one was probably 6'2", but they all wore hoods and had masks on, like ski masks. It sounds totally fake, and I don't care if you don't believe me, but I was scared shitless that day. We began running, and the 3 guys finally gave up, or decided we weren't worth terrorizing, because we lost them. We made it to the main road, where we waited, walking quickly, constantly looking over our shoulders in fear until Margot arrived. We told the police everything, and they searched the woods nearby. They never found any evidence we had been there, or the guys were there, or that anything happened besides pictures of the lake around the area and the shredded tents. I don't know what would have happened if they had caught us. I'm fairly tall. I was around 5'10" during this time, only around 125 pounds. Rose was around 5'1" and 100 pounds, and Zach was barely 5'9" at the time. He probably outweighed me by 10 pounds maximum. I am so thankful that I told Todd about them. I have no doubt they would have been able to catch us if he hadn't been looking over his shoulder constantly, and I am so thankful we all got physical activity regularly, were fast enough to outrun them, and that they gave up. Guess I'll never know. In May 2009, I'd just broken up with my girlfriend of almost 3 years. We'd moved from Calgary to Toronto, and were still stuck living together after the breakup, as we didn't know many people in the city yet. Needless to say, the situation was pretty stressful and upsetting. So when a buddy I was going to school with at the time suggested a weekend camping fishing trip, I jumped at the chance. He grew up in an area about an hour outside of Toronto, called Flamborough. It's really beautiful. Loads of lush forest, farmers' fields, and small rivers and creeks. We decided to camp and fish along a creek called Grindstone Creek. It's close to some wetlands, and the fishing is supposed to be great. We ended up setting up our camp in what was probably a farmer's field. I'm guessing it was trespassing on our part, bordered by a gorgeous forest. We spent the evening fishing and drinking some quality craft beers. As it got darker, we made a little fire and roasted potatoes and hot dogs. All in all, it was a really good night. We turned in just after midnight. We shared a tent. My buddy fell asleep before me, and I stayed up playing on my phone until probably around 1:30. I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was being woken up by a high-pitched yipping type noise. I was kind of groggy, and it took me a moment to fully wake up. The yipping was incessant, and it sounded like a weird coyote. I laid there for a moment, listening, and then started playing on my phone again. The noise was annoying as hell. I tried ignoring it, but it sounded like it was getting closer. Finally, it sounded like it had to be no more than 10 feet from the tent. At this point, I was getting a little unsettled. I had seen coyotes in Calgary before, and I thought of them as pretty harmless. They never looked much bigger than a smallish dog. But what if this one was rabid or something? What if it could smell our food? I have a pretty bad anxiety disorder, so I'm prone to worrying about these types of things. I nudged my buddy to see if he was awake, and he was. The noise woke him up too. We discussed what to do about the coyote, as we hadn't brought anything to scare off critters. Not a BB gun, nothing. Finally, he decided he would shine the flashlight on it and holler a lot, hopefully scaring him off. He unzipped the tent, and I watched him pointing the flashlight out into the darkness. I'll never forget what happened next. His legs suddenly went all wobbly, and he sort of stumbled backwards into the tent. He had a really dumbfounded look on his face when he looked at me and babbled, "It's not a coyote. It's a dude. It's some weird dude." Normally, I would have thought he was messing with me. I'm a huge wimp and scare easily. I won't even watch horror movies. But I've never seen someone look that scared. And I never want to see that expression on someone's face again. So I knew he wasn't pulling my leg. The weird yipping and howling type noises were still going on, and in retrospect it really didn't sound like a coyote, but I guess in our groggy states, it was a way for our brains to make sense of it. Anyways, he kept telling me just to look out the tent flap, to make sure he's not crazy. At this point, I was having a full-blown anxiety attack. My heart was racing, but I had to look. So I slowly peeked out the flap and waited for my eyes to adjust, and that's when I saw him. He was standing only a few arms' lengths away from the tent. He was swaying a little and wearing a baseball cap. What made it awful though, what was really creepy, was that he was wearing women's lingerie. That's when I knew there was most likely something very wrong with this guy. If the making high-pitched noises at a stranger's tent in the middle of the night didn't give it away. After I pulled my head back inside of the tent, my buddy and I discussed what to do. My buddy started yelling, "We're trying to sleep in here!" The noise stopped. It was dead silent, and that's when we heard footsteps running towards our tent. They stopped right outside the tent, but we didn't waste any time. With that, we heard him walk by the tent and head off, sounding like he was moving towards the road. Needless to say, we laid awake, petrified until the first sign of sunlight. Then we hightailed it the hell out of there. We discussed our experience on the way home, and were both pretty embarrassed about how scared we got. It definitely was not manly on either of our parts. I think because we were both ashamed of how we let some weirdo freak us out so much. We really haven't ever talked about it since that day. So there you go. There's my weird story. I'll always wonder what the hell that guy was doing out there, or what was wrong with him. Sometimes I wonder if things would have turned out differently if we were a couple girls. I'm not saying he was some serial killer, but seemed like Krishna Consciousness. I graduated high school almost a year ago. I had really no urge to attend college or the military, and basically got stuck in my boring hometown for months, where I slowly became dependent on Xanax and booze, and was destined to repeat the cycle of white trash set before me by my parents and theirs before me. I knew I had to leave town, so I decided to sign up for a website you may have heard of called woof.com, Worldwide Opportunities in Organic Farming. You pay a small fee, and they make available a directory of organic farming operations that will feed you and allow you to live with them in return for a certain amount of work around the farm. The place I decided to commit to was a Hare Krishna community in the Deep South. I got there and my car almost immediately broke down. It was a 30-year-old Chevy Blazer I bought on Craigslist for $500. Later on, I was to find out it was beyond repair at this point. The closest town was almost 20 miles away, so I found myself stranded and surrounded by the most unbearable hipsters. To be more specific, I'd say about a third of the population of the community were either first or second generation Indian immigrants living near the temple for religious reasons. Another demographic were aging hippies, also there for spiritual purposes, but also running the small-scale organic farm located on the property. I basically kept to myself, but occasionally was forced into conversations about vibrating crystals and their 3-year spiritual journey, no doubt being funded by their parents. I'd been there for weeks and was desperate for a real conversation, and then Michael showed up. I had heard stories about Michael. A couple of days before I showed up, he'd left to retrieve an impounded car in a large city about an hour away. Everyone said he was lazy, insane, and would spend hours up in his room doing yoga instead of coming down and working with the rest of us. He showed up late in the evening, going on about how he was going to really get involved with the farming and throw himself into Krishna Consciousness. He was in his early 30s. He looked like a balding Hasidic Jew, his unwashed sideburns curled. He spoke like a stoner cartoon character, his sentences punctuated with and or and like, giving his utterly fried brain time to figure out what others wanted to hear. He reminded me of many of the friends I left back home. We became fast friends, as he was the only person there who didn't give me the urge to bite my fingers off when he spoke. We were both from Texas, so we talked about the loony conservative teachers we had in high school, football, and of course, drugs. Every now and then, he brought up subjects that really sort of threw me off. He wasn't able to get his car out of the impound garage, so he schemed the best way to break it out. These plans involved firearms, pipe bombs, and telepathy. He told me he'd come to the Hare Krishna temple to befriend some of the gurus and learn Reiki meditation, a form of meditation used to control the minds and bodies of other people. He told me he believed he had used Reiki once to seduce a woman at a party. This is when I understood his reputation. I simply nodded and laughed occasionally when he went off on these rants. I knew one day I would reach a saturation point for this absurdity, but I could probably endure a week more. A couple days later, we were eating lunch with one of the gurus. I was telling Michael about my trip to the giant field where the Branch Davidian used to be. He wasn't sure what the Branch Davidian was, so I explained to him about Waco, David Koresh, and the botched siege by the FBI and ATF that led to the death of 76 Davidians and 4 ATF agents. He was enraged. "The government is always trying to silence people preaching the truth." I wanted to explain to him that David Koresh was sociopathic cult leader, interested in power and nothing else, but he wasn't having it. Now I was angry. He was having a tantrum about a subject, and I had just explained to him. And now he's telling me I'm wrong, and that Koresh was a martyr. This is when I saw the truly insane Michael. He was spitting, red as a beet, pacing back and forth. I left the table and got back to work, but he followed me. After half an hour of this absurd argument, I couldn't handle it anymore. How can I expect logic from you? You came here to get superpowers. The look in his eyes changed from anger to hatred. He got real still and went at me. Michael was a big guy, much bigger than me. He lunged at me and I ran. As I ran, I went through my pocket, praying I had grabbed my knife before I left my cabin. I know it sounds ridiculous, but you don't walk my old neighborhood without some sort of protection. Plus, it was a pretty useful tool on the farm. Luckily, I had grabbed it and turned around so he saw it. He stopped and contemplated for 3 seconds. He quickly turned around and finished his lunch. The next day, I pulled the temple president aside and explained what happened and that we had to get rid of him. It didn't take much convincing. No one really cared for him, and he wasn't much help on the farm. I felt bad snitching on the guy. He was in a pretty desperate situation. He had no car, no money, and I can't imagine he had many friends. The temple president also informed me that he had been an alcoholic for 10 years and had come here to get sober. I found it very strange he never told me this. Later that day, I saw through my window someone drive up and hand him several suitcases to pack what little he had, and I saw them both drive off to God knows where. Weeks went by, and the whole encounter kind of faded from my conscience. Late one night, I got a text. "Hey, this is Michael. We can get my car out for $280. Want to go traveling?" I never responded. I wasn't sure how he got my number, but I figured he'd looked me up on Facebook or something. A few nights later, I was in the temple office, using the Wi-Fi to make some emails. I was making the walk back to my cabin, and from the pitch black, I hear a lot of loud banging coming from a barn. I remember thinking it must be an animal, but also thinking it must be a pretty big one to make that much noise. I entered my cabin. The actual door to the cabin doesn't have a lock, but my bedroom did, so I used that one. I was pretty unsettled by the banging, but I figured my imagination was getting the best of me. Later that night, I woke up needing to take a piss. The cabin didn't have a bathroom, but we had a shared outhouse. I didn't feel like putting on shoes and walking around in the dark, so I figured I'd just piss in the sink. I know it's gross, but I'm the only one who uses that kitchen. I opened my bedroom door and nearly pissed myself right there. Michael, completely naked, was crouching in a corner of my kitchen, facing the wall, I made a noise I wasn't aware I could make, something you would only hear Shaggy make on Scooby-Doo. This noise alerted Michael to my entrance. All he did was glare at me and shook his whole body. I slammed my door and locked it almost immediately. I knew what he was trying to do. He was trying to pacify me with Reiki meditation. I called 911. I didn't open my door or even approach it until I saw the red and blue lights outside my window. Michael wasn't there when they arrived. My guess is he ran deep into the woods that surrounded the farm. I explained me and Michael's history and what had happened that night. There wasn't much they could do, since no one seemed to know anything about Michael. I didn't even know his last name. I had to leave the farm shortly after. Calling the police was really frowned upon, since I believe many of the old hippies thought they were still avoiding the draft. I didn't mind leaving either. I couldn't sleep knowing Michael might be out in those woods, angrier than he was before. I stayed up almost 3 days while I waited for my friend to come pick me up. My conscience still sits heavy. I've been working as an IT systems administrator for a few years now, and have met many people who I occasionally moonlight as a repairwoman for. And yes, I do pay tax. Over the years, friends have told friends, and I occasionally get messages and phone calls from strangers asking for basic computer repairs for cheaper than they could otherwise find locally. For years now, I've been overly cautious of people, places, and objects that don't feel right. I've learned to always trust my gut instinct and to err on the side of caution. This story, however, is the one and only time I ignored that instinct. Around 4 years ago, I was contacted over text message by a local man. He was direct and straight to the point. The conversation was pretty basic. He asked me if I could look at his computer, as he heard about me from a friend. I said yes, and he explained the issue he was having. PC had suddenly stopped booting. Occasionally, he could manage to get it running, but it would operate incredibly slowly and crash quickly. I told the man that I would need to inspect the PC myself. However, it sounded like a textbook hard drive failure. I asked the unknown man to call me to discuss an option and where he could bring the PC to for me to look at. His response was, "No phone calls. Where can I drop it off and when? I need the things off it as soon as possible." This seemed sketchy to me at first. Most people like to talk over the phone about the issues they're having and try to sort them remotely, and at the very least, know how much it was going to cost. I eventually brushed it off, thinking maybe he was just well off and was looking for a fast turnaround, which he knows only a hobbyist would be able to achieve in this area. I discussed a time where he could drop the PC off at my work, and asked what time he would like to drop the PC off. He did not reply. The next morning, at the door of my work, there was a PC on the ground with a post-it note crudely marked with my name in black felt-tip marker. My boss was not super impressed, as our business has quite strict security, and members of the public are not usually allowed onto the premises after hours. I was ultimately very confused, however. I never got a reply from this man, and as far as I knew, he had done a runner. By now, I'm convinced this guy has some sort of social anxiety. A refusal to talk on the phone, and deliberately drop the PC off without a word of warning before our business. Not a client-based business, this is an office block. Even opened its doors to its workers. Again, alarm bells are kind of ringing at this stage. However, there was no reason for me to really worry. It's not as if he seemed on edge or dangerous. Not that I could really tell in the few text messages we had sent each other. I proceeded as planned, ran diagnostic tools, confirmed it was a dead drive, removed the drive, replaced it with a repurposed one, reinstalled the OS, and proceeded to start the recovery process. For those of you not informed of the process, here is the basic rundown. Pull the old hard drive, plug it into a working PC, either directly or with a dock. Create a virtual clone of the drive, and then perform the recovery using specialized software on the clone, not the actual hard drive, as it may fail during the process. I did this with good results and managed to recover pretty much everything. I copied all his files over to his new drive, reinstalled the applications I could see he had, and sent the computer on its merry way. Later that day, I sent the man a message stating that his computer was fixed and he could come pick it up sometime during business hours. He responded a few hours later, saying that he was not going to be available until after work. Okay, I thought, that's fair enough. He's probably working too. At first, the man asked if he could meet me at my house after work the following day, which by this stage was definitely too weird. I obviously declined and insisted on meeting him at the local post office at around 6 p.m. By this stage, I was kind of getting some pretty bad heebie-jeebies. I decided to have a friend come with me, just in case things got weird. I have a male friend at work who was happy to come with. We arrive at the post office a little early and sit on the small park bench out the front. About 15 minutes pass, and the guy finally arrives. By this stage, it's getting pretty dark. Thinking back now, I'm pretty sure he delayed it as much as he could. The man walks up to us slowly in a kind of predatory way, creeping forward as to make as little noise as possible, even though we knew he was there. His gray jeans stained with what looked like white paint, wearing a dark hoodie covering his head. All we can see of his face is the protruding, long gray tattered beard. The man stands in front of us while I introduce myself and my friend. The man does not react at all. Instead, seemingly looking me up and down for what felt like minutes. I could smell his breath from where I was standing, and his silence was only broken by the sound of his nose hairs whistling as he breathed. I eventually try and speak to him about his PC, stating that it was, in fact, a dead hard drive. However, before I could finish speaking, he interrupts me mid-sentence with a raspy voice. The kind of voice that makes you feel a tingle at the back of your throat. "Is that the computer?" I responded, "Yes." "Did you get everything back?" The man quickly responded, in more of a statement rather than a question. "Yes, I told you in the text message." In a quick and angry voice, he then asked me, "Did you go through any of it?" "Of course not." "Are you sure?" At this point, I was getting really weirded out, and my friend could tell I felt threatened. I do not deal well with older men, and he knew it. He swiftly responded with, "Look man, the computer's fixed, and you have your data back. Do you want it or not?" I looked at my friend, then back at the man. He looked me up and down one last time, thrusted some notes into my hand, quickly grabbed the PC and swiftly but silently walked away to the car park. We got back in the car, and I soon realized the man had paid me $400 for a simple repair. We never discussed the price, as that usually happens early in the discussion, or as they return for their computer. But usually this would only cost around $150. I was shocked and very happy. My friend was not so happy. Something was very, very off about that man, and now I'm even more convinced. Did you notice how intent he was on you not going through his data? I agreed. Something weird was going on. Although I am not supposed to, and doing so is kind of a breach of privacy, my itch to know what he was so paranoid about was strong. The next day at work, having been bugged by my friend, I finally decided to take a look at the contents of the clone drive. I noticed pretty quickly that it was quite large, around 250 gig for what was essentially a Windows install and some basic applications, photos, and a few downloads. It can be tricky to find what is taking up so much space sometimes, but using a tool like Space Sniffer can really help. I booted the program up and quickly found a zip file hidden in his Windows folder under a very long tree of folders. Inside these folders were other empty folders. Some had empty documents in them. Others were completely empty. I jumped straight to the zip file and opened it, luckily not password protected. What I found inside makes me feel sick, even more so given what I have been through in my life. Thousands and thousands of images and videos of children, some suggestive, others more. I opened 3 or 4 photos and immediately felt lightheaded and sick. I quickly closed the zip folder, shocked. Oddly enough, it did not settle in until some time later what I had found. All I was thinking about before that was what would happen if a colleague saw those images in the building. Little did it occur to me what kind of threat this man was and what now lay on my desk. I told my friend, who told me to call the police ASAP. I did, and was asked to not touch the image further, and to come into the station to make a report with my friend. They later confiscated the drive I had copied the clone to, and I never got it back. I was told by police a week or so later that the phone number the man used to send me text messages was a web-based application, and the phone number was fake. However, they had identified the man thanks to the metadata stored on the hard drive clone, and the man probably did not realize a copy was made of his drive in the process of recovery. They also told me the man was being looked for. However, his last known residency was in a different state. The police believed he was staying somewhere without a lease, with a friend, or simply squatting and has since skipped town. It has been 4 years now, and I have heard nothing. I am still paranoid he's going to come to my office building again, or follow me home. I have surrounded my house with self-defense items just in case, and my home feels safe. However, work, not so much. Like I said earlier, most people go through life without ever seeing the scum of society. I have experienced it myself 3 times now, and I am done. Never ever again. So please, creepy man with the most spine-chillingly raspy voice I've ever heard, please do not come to my workplace. You almost cost me my job, and the thought of what you might have done in the past, or what you might do in the future, haunts. My vague memory. It was 1995, and I just moved into an upper-class neighborhood in southwest Florida. Compared to my previous neighborhood, full of professional adults and elderly couples, this neighborhood was a haven full of children my age, and even a neighborhood park and community pool. Things started to get weird right from the get-go, my third night there. I heard this weird tapping on my window. Being as my bed was up against the wall where the window was, I was not about to sit up and investigate. The tapping continued for about 20 minutes, but I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I thought maybe it had been a dream and put it out of my mind for as long as I could. I got ready for school and went to the bus stop, waiting with my sister, who was 2 years older. This older man comes up to the both of us and starts to talk about how he wishes his daughter was around on the weekday so she can go to school with us and ride the bus. He then offers to drive us to school, since the bus seems to be taking so long. We knew better, and politely declined, feeling relieved when the big yellow bus pulled up a few moments later. He seemed disappointed, but still maintained a smile and told us to have a great day. We decided to tell our parents, because we thought they would get mad at us for talking to someone we did not know. That night, the creepiness reached a new level. I heard the same tapping on the window, only now it was more distinct and was getting stronger. I turned over, thinking my blinds would be down, only to realize in horror that they were pulled 3/4 of the way up. I was face to face with the creep from earlier, and he just stared at me. A slight smirk on his face, he told me to unlock the window so I could come outside and play with him and his daughter. Being on the spectrum, I trusted people way too easily, and as I thought about how fun it would be, disregarding the time, I said, in full sincerity, "Let me ask my mom." His face turned into this scowl I will never forget, and banged on the window and demanded I open it immediately. At this point, my dad comes into the room and turns on my light. Having heard some of my side of the conversation, he pieced together what was going on and made eye contact with the guy for about 2 seconds before running outside after him. He did not catch up with him, but did call the police. It turns out the man did have a daughter that he lost custody of due to sexually assaulting her. She did not live with him and had not done so in years. I do not remember what he was charged with, but I believe he spent a little time. My weirdest experience. Back in 2008, I was a student planning to go to university and needed some extracurricular stuff I could put on my entry applications. As most UK students know, one of the best to have on there is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. As part of this award, you have to embark on an orienteering expedition, basically a long trek through woodland and rural villages, following nothing but a map and compass, no GPS allowed. It's a teamwork experience, and you camp and overcome hurdles together, etc. Anyway, I was out of shape at the time, and so my uncle volunteered to take me out to the middle of nowhere to get some idea of what orienteering was like. We didn't stay out overnight like what I would have to during the real thing, but we hiked maybe 10 miles through woods and a small village in pretty abysmal weather. By the end of the journey, we were soaked to the bone and pretty miserable, looking forward to getting back to the car and heading home. For the last part of the journey, we were on a dirt trail heading uphill with bushes and trees either side. We were marching onward in silence at this point, when all of a sudden there was a rustling in the foliage to our left. From behind a large bush stepped an old man in a black suit with a red bow tie and dress shoes. He looked late 70s, early 80s, very pale, liver spots dotting his face, and a gray-white comb-over. I was instantly weirded out. Who dresses like that to go into the woods? The instant thought, seeing a guy his age out there in those clothes, in those weather conditions, was, this guy has lost his marbles. There was something else that took me an extra moment to notice, though, that puzzled me. The guy was bone dry, didn't even have mud on his shoes. We stopped in our tracks and just stared at the man for a moment, who appeared to be as frozen and shocked at seeing us. My uncle made the first move, taking a step towards him, asking him if he was all right. The old man continued to stare for a moment, not moving even a twitch, then became suddenly very animated. It was like he suddenly snapped out of a trance. He started flailing his arms wildly, saying something awful had happened, that a good friend of his needed help. He began walking backwards into the woods, motioning for us to follow him, which we did. We started off at a brisk walk, then escalated to running as we struggled to keep up with the old man. After maybe a minute, he disappeared ahead of us, but we could hear him, so continued to follow the noise until we reached a huge slope. We stopped at the edge and looked down to see the old man standing at the bottom, motioning us, pleading with us to follow him. I remember looking down, and the slope was probably at a 40-degree angle, spanned for perhaps 50 feet or more and slick with mud. It looked like an accident waiting to happen, especially given there were no shrubs or roots to hold onto or anything. I remember looking down at the old man on the other side of the slope and wondering how the heck did he cross that so quickly and so cleanly. I mean, at that distance it's hard to see fine detail clearly, but I swear he did not appear to be wet or muddy at all. Me and my uncle looked at each other, and I saw that he was getting as weirded out as I was. Despite my feelings, I made a step toward the edge and was going to try and make my way down when my uncle grabbed me firmly by the arm and pulled me back. Under his breath, he said to me, "Something's wrong here." We took a few steps back from the edge at this point, and the old man at the bottom started getting irate. He began pleading with us again to come down the slope, telling us he needed our help. His friend was in trouble. My uncle shouted down to the old man that we would head back to our car and call emergency services for him, that professional help would be on its way soon, that they would have all the tools to help him, etc. The old man suddenly got furious. He began jumping up and down, demanding that we come down the slope right now, or there would be hell to pay. His voice had changed drastically. He was practically growling his words, his hands bunched up into fists, pounding his knees like an angry toddler throwing a tantrum. I've never seen a grown adult fly into such a rage in my life. His eyes looked like they were on the verge of bursting out of their sockets. His skin gone from pale to red in almost an instant. We began to hurriedly make our way back the way we came, his demands and threats getting less audible as we got closer to the trail. Once on the trail, we practically power marched the remaining quarter mile or so to the car. All the while my uncle was on the phone to the emergency services, explaining to them that there was a possible mentally ill old man wandering the trail. We were ordered to get to our car and await the police so we could show them where we had encountered him. About an hour later, we met 4 officers, 2 of whom had dogs with them and packs of supplies like first aid, emergency blankets, etc. We led them to the exact spot and then pointed the 2 officers with dogs in the direction he leads us through the bushes. The search lasted all weekend, but there was no trace of the old man. Officers said the only trail they could pick up had been mine and my uncle's. They didn't find any footprints or anything belonging to the old man we had the mysterious woman. I work summers as a camp counselor in the northern parts of Ontario, Canada. On the date this particular incident occurred, I was camping with a group of 10-year-old boys on the same lake the summer camp was based on. So, like a routine camping trip, we canoe out to the site and set up our tents. Me and my co-counselor, Mike, take turns supervising the kids while they swim, build forts, and play games, etc. We cook some food over the fire, sit around and tell stories, cook, the typical Canadian camping experience. Around 9:30ish, I tell the kids it's time for bed, and they head into their tents, which were positioned a small walk away from the shoreline, but still in line of sight from where we had the fire pit. So the kids have gone to bed, and me and Mike are shooting the shit by the water, smoking a cigarette, just basically hanging out, before we decide to head into our tent and call it a night. What happened next still troubles me to this day, and remains my go-to scary campfire story. We were both gazing into the pitch-black night water when we saw a small light approaching us slowly and slightly above water level. We speculated what it could possibly be for a few minutes before it came close enough for us to see that it was mounted on the front of a kayak and that someone was approaching our campsite. Now, it is important to note that as a camp counselor, part of our training goes over how to deal with stranger encounters in an environment where we're responsible for a group of children on public property. I was prepared to give the mystery paddler the typical speech about how we're camping with a group from a recognized organization, and we would respectfully ask that they find another campsite. However, this person's appearance shook me to the bone as the light drew nearer. Paddling this kayak was a woman who looked to be in her 60s. She had incredibly long wisps of gray hair that was trailing in the water. Her skin looked like old leather, and her dead-looking eyes were tough to spot under all her wrinkles. She looked directly at me, and when she spoke, I realized she was missing most of her teeth. "Are all your children safe in bed?" she asked me, pointing in the direction of the tents. Not really knowing how to respond, and quite frankly shitting myself, I responded by telling her that they were fine, and she had to leave. "That's good. Just as expected for this time," she said with a smile, then turned her kayak and paddled off into the night. At this point in time, myself and Mike were legitimately very creeped out, not only by the appearance of this mystery woman who resembled a freaking corpse, but also her inquiry on the whereabouts and safety of the kids we had brought on this trip. Not knowing what else to do, we grabbed our hunting knives and sat by the fire after checking on the kids. Half an hour later is where shit started to get really creepy. Across the lake, a female counselor was leading another trip for kids the same age group. She sent me a text which read something along the lines of, "Hey, Sean, stop screwing with us. This isn't funny. My kids are really creeped out." I instantly called her and let her know I'd just seen someone near my campsite that seemed eerie, and that I was not trying to play a joke. Apparently, one of their kids had opened their tent door to take a piss and seen a woman with long hair, standing with her arms open towards them near the shoreline. The scariest encounters in my life. In the early 80s, when I was 8, my family was visiting my uncle who lived in backwoods Missouri. He lived on a lot of land, and the only other people who really even lived on the streets were relatives, so no one else ever just happened to be out there. This meant no one ever locked their doors, because random family members were always coming by for this or that. One night, while we were there, my parents and aunt and uncle decided to go to a nearby town to go bowling. My brothers, my female cousins and I'm female, stayed home. It was still daylight when the adults left, but it started raining pretty hard and got dark quickly. We used to play this game that was essentially hide and seek in the dark house, but we cleverly called it Vampire. There was a thin little mattress on the living room floor that some of the kids would sleep on at night, so the person who was it would lie on the mattress and fold it over themselves like a coffin and count down to midnight. When they got to midnight, they went looking for you. Again, all of the lights are off, and you tried to make it back to the coffin before you got caught. Because the house was in the country, it was pitch black at night. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. What this meant for the game was that, 1, you couldn't tell where the vampire was looking, so you just had to make a break for it, and 2, if you were extremely lazy, and I'm sure by now you can guess which one of us met those standards, you could hide in the living room with the coffin and get to base quickly. Ben, my 11-year-old brother, was it, and was doing the normal countdown. I was hiding maybe 6 feet from him. As he's counting, there's a flash of lightning. I don't know if I was already looking at the living room window, or if the lightning made me look, but with the backlight of the lightning, I see a man with his face against the window. He had his hands on each side of his face, as if he's trying to peer in, and looks exactly like the stereotypical creepster, heavy-set, scraggly beard, etc. I could feel every hair on my body standing on end. Immediately, I began trying to convince myself that I didn't see what I saw. But then Ben sternly whispered, "If anyone is hiding in here, stay still." I sort of croaked out an, "I'm here," right as there was another flash of lightning. Creepster was still there, but was no longer trying to look in the window. Instead, he was now looking toward the front door. Ben and I immediately knew what was coming next. From where he was standing, Creepster was probably only 5 feet from the front door. Ben was the same distance, but there was a couch between him and the door. Ben leapt over the couch and locked the door right as Creepster started trying the handle. At this point, I guess Ben decided that it was best to let Creepster know that people were home and that we knew he was there, because he flipped on the porch light and then started turning on the lights in the house. This is going to sound weird, but I was too terrified to panic. Having said that, I was relying completely on Ben to know and tell me what to do. He told me to go lock the other doors and was yelling for everyone else to come out and to lock all of the windows. Honestly, the next few minutes are hazy in my mind. I remember everything up until this point extremely clearly. Then I remember the end very clearly, but I'm less clear about the middle. I know that I locked the side door, and then the sliding glass door on the back of the house. When we've talked about it over the years, some people remember us seeing him out the back door as well. I don't think I remember that. What I clearly recall is locking the sliding glass door and standing there frozen and hearing Ben, in a very calm but firm voice, say, "Close the curtain. Listen to me, okay? Close the curtain." So I did. Ben can't remember that part, and I just remember my fear in Ben's voice, so I'm not sure if I saw a Creepster in the backyard or not. We tried to call the police, but my aunt and uncle had a stupid party line, and it wouldn't work. Whether from the storm or from a neighbor leaving it off the hook or whatever. For the record, they're the only people I've ever known with a party line, so this wasn't normal to me either. But for those of you who don't know what that is, in really rural areas, multiple people on the street would actually share a phone line. It would have different rings for different households, but you could pick up the phone and listen to your neighbor's conversation. We also tried to summon help on my uncle's CB radio, but couldn't reach anyone. My uncle was a hunter, so he had a gun rack full of rifles in his room, but my older cousin was on out-of-town hunting trip and took them with him. All we could find was a BB gun that looked like a real rifle. I vividly remember Ben putting me on phone duty and Scott, my older brother, on CB duty, while he stood watch at the little square window on the front door with the BB gun. Maybe 30 minutes later, Ben said, "He's back. He's coming up the driveway." The rest of us froze in fear, but Ben opened the front door and stepped out on the porch, pointed the gun, and said, "Get out of here right now." Then we hear our cousin Kyle, who lived down the road a bit, say, "You know that's a BB gun, right?" Even though Kyle was only 15, I remember that we felt like we had been saved when he showed up. Kyle seemed really skeptical of our story, like we were playing a trick on him, even though we had no idea that he was coming. But he stayed with us until our parents came home. Honestly, I don't remember if we even told our parents what happened when they got home. There was definitely no police involvement though. We just went on with our trip. The strange sound from my porch. When I was about 10 or 11 years old, I shared a room with my older brother who was around 15. We live in a suburb area in New York. Not the greatest area, but not riddled with crime. There are 2 windows in my room, one that overlooks the backyard, and one that connects to the front porch. It came in quite handy for my brother to sneak out and meet with friends. If you step out the window, you're on the porch, so anyone on the porch can access this window. I was never bothered by that, though, because quite honestly, it had never crossed my mind. My bed was touching this window, while my brother's bed was perpendicular to mine. It was an odd setup, but that's beside the point. Now, this was before we had any sort of smartphone or laptop to keep ourselves occupied. So on nights when we weren't sleepy, we would stay up talking to each other and making up dumb games to pass time. This event took place during the summer. We stayed up into the late hours of the night, perks of having no school. It was probably around 2 a.m., and eventually were playing a game where one of us was a goalkeeper and the other was taking a shot, football or soccer terms. We would both say at the same time either left, center, or right. If the goalkeeper guessed the same as the one taking the shot, he would get a point, and if the person taking the shot said a position other than what the goalie said, they got a point. We went for a couple of rounds of this, and I was beating his ass at it, even though that's irrelevant. I don't remember what round we were on, but we did our 3-2-1 countdown. My brother, the goalkeeper, said left. I, the shooter, said center. The voice from outside the porch window said left. Me and my brother froze. We had the shade down, but my mom had left the porch light on, so that was the only light illuminating our room. The dim porch light coming in from the borders of the shade. At the time, in my house was my mother on the opposite side of the house, my sister the room over, my dad in the basement, and me and my brother shitting our pants practically. We waited for what seemed like an hour, but was probably only 30 to 45 seconds, and we heard a giggle and a playful knock at the window. "Let's go another round. Come on, boys," the voice said in a cheerful, playful tone. Honestly, I want to say it was a scary voice and sounded menacing, but it didn't. It sounded like a woman, not too old, but not young, and it was just normal. Like a normal sounding voice, nothing off about it, besides where it was coming from and the time it came. Me and my brother were seriously freaked out, and I was about to break down because of how close I was to this woman. The thought that all I had to do was lift the shade and I'd be face to face with this person scared the shit out of me and made me go as still and stiff as if I had just looked into Medusa's eyes. After a while of me and my brother not responding, my brother started slowly moving from his bed to the door, as to not make any noise. As my brother was tiptoeing to the door, the sound of nails being ran down a window started. It was very slow from top to bottom. At that point, my brother made it to the door. He looked back at me and brought his finger to his lips, gesturing me to keep quiet. Once the nails stopped running down my window, I heard her light footsteps make their way off my porch and disappear. I laid there for an eternity, not moving until my brother returned, and I saw my mom move hastily by my door, making her way to the front door. The porch light flipped off, and I was left in darkness, with my brother waiting in the doorway for my mom's return. I heard my mom call my dad up the stairs, and his groggy, annoyed footsteps coming upstairs. They talked, then came in me and my brother's room, and we relayed what happened. Apparently, my mom caught sight of the lady turning out of our driveway, on foot, behind some tall bushes. Thank God we had a long driveway. Otherwise, my mom probably would have thought we were crazy. Considering no harm was done besides leaving me terrified of my window, my parents didn't call the police. They just thought it was really weird and stayed up the rest of the night to make sure she didn't return. I'm 17 now. My brother is in college, so I have the room to myself. My bed still touches the window because I'm too lazy to move the rest of the furniture in my room so I can move my bed. The shade to that window has not been opened since that incident, and probably never will be.